They watched the Grumman Wildcat absorb the hits and keep flying. May 8, 1942, in the cloudy skies above the Coral Sea, Japanese Zero pilots pressed their attacks on American fighters with the confidence born from 6 months of unbroken victory. Their 20mm cannon shells struck home. Their 7.7mm machine gun bullets found their marks. The Wildcats should have been burning. They were not. Petty Officer First Class Kyoto Furuta, flying from the carrier Shokaku, watched his rounds impact a Wildcat's fuselage near the wing route where American aircraft carried their fuel. The distinctive puffs of cannon strikes were visible. The Wildcat shuddered from the impacts, rolled hard to the right, and dove away toward the American carriers far below. But there was no fire. No trailing smoke. No disintegration of the airframe that Zero pilots had come to expect when they hit an enemy's fuel supply. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the WWII story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Furuta had seen this before, in previous engagements since April. American aircraft that should have been catastrophic kills continued fighting or managed to return to their carriers. The Zero pilots discussed it among themselves between missions. Perhaps the Americans were simply lucky. Perhaps the fuel had already been consumed from those particular tanks. Perhaps the rounds had passed through without igniting the gasoline vapor. But on this morning of May 8, 1942, as the first major carrier battle in history reached its climax, the pattern was unmistakable. Something about the American fighters made them unexpectedly resilient to battle damage that would doom a Zero. The Japanese pilots did not know what they were witnessing. They could not have known. Their intelligence services had not informed them. Their technical experts had not briefed them. The simple, profound reality that would shape the outcome of the air war in the Pacific remained invisible to them, even as they watched its effects with their own eyes. The Grumman F4F Wildcats they were shooting at had self-sealing fuel tanks. This technology, this innovation, this unglamorous advancement in rubber chemistry and engineering would prove more consequential to the Pacific Air War than engine horsepower, than cannon caliber, than maximum speed or rate of climb. It represented a fundamental philosophical difference in aircraft design, a difference the Japanese High Command had observed, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed. That dismissal would cost the Imperial Japanese Navy hundreds of trained pilots, the most precious resource in carrier aviation, men who could not be replaced quickly enough to matter. The story of how American fighters came to have self-sealing tanks and why Japanese fighters did not begins not with combat, but with observation. In the summer and autumn of 1940, while Japan continued its expansion in China and prepared for wider conflict, the Battle of Britain raged over England. British and German aircraft clashed in the skies above London, Dover, and the English countryside. American military observers watched carefully. They noted the tactics, the aircraft performance, the weapons' effectiveness, but they also noted something more prosaic and more important: aircraft survivability. German bombers and fighters, they observed, often returned to their bases in France despite battle damage that would have been fatal to earlier designs. British fighters that took hits continued fighting or managed to nurse damaged aircraft back to their airfields. Both sides had implemented a technology that the observers' reports consistently mentioned: selbstdichtende Kraftstofftanks, self-sealing fuel tanks. The concept was not new. An American named George Murdoch had filed a patent for self-sealing fuel tank coverings in February 1917, though the First World War ended before widespread implementation. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the technology existed but remained largely ignored. Weight was the enemy, range was paramount. Adding layers of rubber and sealant to fuel tanks meant adding weight, reducing fuel capacity, and decreasing aircraft performance. For fighters designed to intercept bombers or engage in aerial combat, every pound mattered. The Battle of Britain changed that calculation. German Messerschmitt 1-10 fighters, examined by American technical experts after being shot down over England, revealed sophisticated fuel tank protection. Multiple layers of vulcanized and non-vulcanized rubber surrounded the metal tanks. When bullets or shrapnel penetrated the tank, leaking fuel caused the untreated rubber layer to swell, sealing the puncture. The system was not perfect. It could not seal large holes or prevent all fires, but it dramatically increased the chance. that a damaged aircraft could return home rather than burn in flight or crash short of friendly territory. The United States Navy paid attention. In 1940, the Bureau of Aeronautics directed that self-sealing fuel tanks be developed and tested for American naval aircraft. The Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia, became the center of this effort. 4 major rubber manufacturers committed resources to the project: Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, Goodrich, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, and United States Rubber Company. Each pursued slightly different approaches. Each competed to produce the most effective design. The testing was exhaustive. Tanks were shot with 30 caliber machine guns, then with 50 caliber machine guns. They were shot at various angles. They were shot at different ranges. They were tested at normal temperatures, then at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, to simulate operations in Alaska or at high altitude, where rubber becomes brittle. They were tested with 100-octane aviation gasoline, the standard fuel for American aircraft. Engineers filled the tanks, shot them, and measured how quickly they sealed. They measured weight penalties. They measured fuel capacity losses. They measured the reliability of the sealing mechanism after repeated bullet strikes. By late 1940 and early 1941, satisfactory designs emerged. Chemist Elmo Hansen of Firestone filed a patent on January 21, 1941. Ernst Egger of United States Rubber Company filed his patent later that same year. Goodyear chemist James Merrill refined a 2-layer system that would prove particularly effective and would later receive a War Production Board citation from President Roosevelt in 1942. The designs varied in detail but shared common principles: multiple layers of rubber, careful attention to the properties of each layer, suspension systems to prevent overpressurization from bullet impacts. The decision to install self-sealing tanks in the Grumman F4F Wildcat came in 1941. The British, who had ordered Wildcats under the name Martlet, had already begun requesting protection features based on their combat experience. The United States Navy, recognizing that war with Japan was increasingly likely, mandated that new production F4, F3 aircraft include pilot armor and protected fuel tanks. The early F4, F3 models that rolled off the Grumman production line in 1940 lacked these features. Later, production aircraft incorporated them. By late 1941, installation of self-sealing tank retrofits on existing Wildcats stationed on the East Coast had begun. The modification was not trivial. The Wildcat's fuel system originally consisted of simple metal tanks in the wings and fuselage. Converting to self-sealing tanks meant installing new tanks with the rubber protection already built in, or in some cases, surrounding existing tanks with protective layers. The weight increased. The fuel capacity decreased slightly. The complexity of the fuel system increased. Mechanics had to ensure proper sealing at all filler necks and connections. Early problems emerged. Some tanks leaked. Some failed to seal properly. Gasoline could penetrate the rubber layer under certain conditions, causing particles of rubber to flake off and clog fuel strainers or carburetor jets. These problems were identified and corrected through field experience. In April 1942, the carrier Yorktown experienced multiple Wildcats with fuel system problems traced to faulty self-sealing tanks. The issue was serious enough that Admiral Fletcher considered withdrawing to port for repairs. Replacement tanks with improved sealing were shipped forward. Mechanics worked to replace the defective tanks before the next operation. By early May 1942, when Yorktown and Lexington entered the Coral Sea, their Wildcats had functioning self-sealing fuel tanks. The pilots did not think much about this. It was simply part of their aircraft, like the armor plate behind their seats or the 50 caliber machine guns in their wings. The Japanese approach to fighter design had followed a different path entirely. When the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications for a new carrier fighter in 1937, the requirements emphasized range, maneuverability, and speed. The aircraft would need to escort bombers on long-range missions over China. It would need to outmaneuver enemy fighters in aerial combat. It would need sufficient speed to intercept bombers. Designer Jiro Horikoshi of Mitsubishi understood that meeting these requirements meant reducing weight wherever possible. The solution was ruthless weight reduction. Horikoshi's team used a new lightweight aluminum alloy called extra super duraluminum, which was strong but required protective coating against corrosion. They eliminated pilot armor. They eliminated radio equipment from most aircraft, installing radios in only 1 out of every 3 or 4 fighters, and they eliminated any protection for the fuel system. The fuel tanks in the Mitsubishi A6M0 were simple aluminum vessels, strong enough to hold fuel and withstand the stresses of flight, but offering no protection whatsoever against battle damage. This was not an oversight. It was a conscious decision based on a specific design philosophy. Japanese naval aviation doctrine in the late 1930s emphasized offense over defense. Pilots were trained to shoot first, to maintain initiative, to destroy the enemy before the enemy could shoot back. The assumption was that superior pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability would prevent most battle damage. Any weight spent on protection was weight that could instead be spent on fuel for longer range, or could simply be eliminated to improve performance. The Zero that first flew in April 1939 and entered service in July 1940 embodied this philosophy completely. The aircraft was extraordinary. It could reach speeds of 346 miles per hour. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.5 minutes. It could turn inside any fighter then in service anywhere in the world. Its range, with a drop tank, exceeded 1,600 miles. It mounted 2 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns. In combat over China beginning in August 1940, it established immediate air superiority. Chinese fighters could not match it. Soviet-supplied aircraft could not match it. Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed almost unbelievable. This success reinforced every assumption behind the Zero's design. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks seemed justified by results. Zeros rarely took battle damage because Zeros rarely lost combat. The few that were damaged either made it back to base or were lost with their pilots, leaving no data to suggest the design needed revision. Japanese naval aviation entered the Pacific War in December 1941 with the most capable carrier fighter in the world and with absolute confidence in their design philosophy. That confidence was not misplaced in December 1941 or January 1942 or February 1942. The Zeros dominated combat wherever they appeared. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, over Burma, Japanese pilots flying Zeros established air superiority against opposition that simply could not match the aircraft's performance. American, British, and Dutch pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, and various other fighters found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought. The Zero's reputation grew. It became a symbol of Japanese air power, feared by Allied pilots throughout the Pacific. But reputation and reality had already begun to diverge. The Wildcats that began arriving in American carrier fighter squadrons in 1940-41 brought with them not just guns and armor, but a fundamental philosophical difference in what constituted acceptable aircraft design. American naval aviators would not fly fighters that lacked basic protection. The Navy would not accept aircraft that burned too easily when damaged. The industrial capacity existed to add protection without crippling performance. Therefore, protection would be added. It was that simple. This difference in philosophy reflected deeper differences in industrial capacity, in cultural approaches to warfare, in calculations about acceptable losses, and in assumptions about how the war would be fought. The United States could afford the weight penalty of self-sealing tanks because American industry could produce engines powerful enough to compensate. American doctrine accepted that fighters would be hit in combat and planned for damaged aircraft to return home. American logistics assumed that pilots and aircraft both would need to survive multiple combat missions because training new pilots and building new aircraft took time and resources. Everything about American carrier aviation was built on the premise that survivability mattered, that today's pilot would need to fly again tomorrow, that preserving experienced crews would pay dividends over months and years of sustained combat. The Japanese calculation was different. Japanese industry could not afford weight penalties as easily. Japanese pilot training produced extraordinarily skilled aviators, but in smaller numbers. Japanese logistics assumed short, decisive campaigns rather than prolonged attrition. Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive battle and decisive victory, not sustained combat over years. The Zero was optimized for the kind of war Japan expected to fight: aggressive, offensive, quick, and victorious. The two philosophies, embodied in the two fighter designs, would meet over the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, and, In that meeting, in the combat that raged that morning and afternoon, the Japanese pilots would observe something they could not explain and did not understand. They would shoot at Wildcats. They would score hits. And too often, inexplicably, the Wildcats would not burn. The evidence accumulated in combat after combat, but the pattern remained invisible to Japanese intelligence. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thach flew from the carrier Yorktown during the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. His 6 Wildcats escorted 12 Devastator torpedo bombers toward the Japanese carriers. At approximately 1000 hours, 15 to 20 Zeros bounced the formation. One Wildcat burst into flames almost immediately. The pilot died, but Thach's aircraft and several others took multiple hits and survived. Thach himself felt rounds strike his Wildcat. He saw tracers pass through his wings. The aircraft shook from impacts, but there was no fire. No catastrophic fuel system failure, just holes in metal that could be patched, damage that could be repaired. Thach employed the defensive tactic he had developed, the weave maneuver that would later bear his name. 2 Wildcats flying together would turn toward each other when threatened, creating a defensive scissors pattern that brought pursuing Zeros into each other's gun sights. It worked. Thach shot down 3 Zeros that morning. His wingmen got more. But what struck him later, what he noted in his after-action reports, was not just the tactical success. It was that damaged Wildcats kept flying. Aircraft that had been hit, that by all logic should have been burning wrecks falling into the Pacific, instead made it back to Yorktown. The Japanese Zero pilots who survived that engagement and returned to their carriers saw the same pattern from the other side. They had engaged American fighters. They had scored hits with cannon and machine gun fire. Some Wildcats had gone down, yes, but too many had not. Too many had absorbed damage that would destroy a Zero and continued fighting or escaped by diving away at high speed. The Zero pilots reported this to their officers. The officers included it in their intelligence summaries. But the reports did not trigger the correct analysis. No one connected the pattern to fuel system design. No one considered that the Americans might have developed protection the Zeros lacked. Part of the problem was conceptual. Japanese naval aviation had invested heavily in the design philosophy embodied by the Zero. To acknowledge that this philosophy had a fatal flaw would require rethinking assumptions that underlay Japan's entire carrier air warfare doctrine. It was easier to attribute American survivability to luck, to poor Japanese gunnery, to tactical mistakes. The institutional incentives all pushed toward maintaining the existing worldview rather than questioning it. Part of the problem was practical. Japan lacked access to intact examples of American aircraft early in the war. The few Wildcats that crashed in areas controlled by Japanese forces were usually too damaged to provide useful intelligence about fuel system design. Japanese technical intelligence focused on performance characteristics that could be observed or measured externally: speed, climb rate, armament, armor thickness. Internal systems like fuel tanks were harder to assess without disassembly and analysis, and Japanese intelligence simply did not prioritize this kind of detailed technical investigation. But the largest part of the problem was that the evidence contradicted what Japanese pilots and commanders wanted to believe. The Zero was supposed to be superior. It was supposed to dominate American fighters in combat. When Zeros scored hits on Wildcats and the Wildcats did not burn, this created cognitive dissonance. Rather than question their assumptions, Japanese aviators rationalized. The hits must not have been solid. The fuel tanks must have been empty. The American pilot must have been lucky. Anything. But the actual truth, that American aircraft had technical protection Japanese aircraft lacked. The pattern intensified over Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, American Marines landed on the island and captured the Japanese airfield under construction there. They renamed it Henderson Field. Within days, Marine fighter squadrons flying Wildcats began operating from the primitive base. The Japanese response was immediate and sustained. Almost daily, bombers and Zero fighters flew the 650 miles from Rabaul to attack Henderson Field and the American forces on Guadalcanal. Almost daily, the Wildcats of the Cactus Air Force scrambled to intercept them. The combat over Guadalcanal produced kill ratios that shocked Japanese commanders. Marine pilots like Major John Smith and Captain Marion Carl shot down Zeros in numbers that seemed disproportionate to the technical capabilities of their aircraft. Smith's squadron, VMF-223, claimed 19 Japanese aircraft, destroyed in their first major engagement on August 20th. Carl became the first Marine Corps ace of the war on August 24th. These men were skilled pilots, certainly. They benefited from early warning provided by coast watchers and radar, which allowed them to gain altitude advantage before the Japanese arrived. They employed good tactics, avoiding turning fights with the more maneuverable Zeros and instead using hit-and-run attacks. But they also flew aircraft that could survive battle damage. Major Joe Renner, commanding officer of VMF-121, observed that a Zero could not withstand more than 2 seconds of fire from a Wildcat's 50 caliber machine guns, but a Wildcat could sometimes absorb 15 minutes of fire from a Zero. 15 minutes. That was not hyperbole based on a single incident. That was a pattern observed repeatedly in combat. Wildcats returned to Henderson Field with dozens of bullet holes, wings perforated by cannon shells, fuselages punctured by machine gun fire, and yet the aircraft flew. The pilots lived. The fuel did not ignite. The contrast with Zero losses was stark. When a Wildcat's 50 caliber rounds struck a Zero's fuel tanks, the result was frequently catastrophic. The thin aluminum skin provided no protection. The unprotected fuel tanks ruptured. Gasoline sprayed into the airstream. Tracer rounds or incendiary ammunition ignited the fuel. The Zero became a fireball. Japanese pilots who witnessed their squadron mates die this way remembered the sight for the rest of their lives. The Zero did not just burn, it disintegrated. The lightweight structure could not withstand fire. Pilots often could not escape before the aircraft exploded or the control surfaces failed. By September 1942, the kill ratio between Wildcats and Zeros over Guadalcanal had reached approximately 1.5 to 1 in favor of the Wildcats. This was remarkable given the Zero's superior speed and maneuverability. By February 1943, when the Guadalcanal campaign concluded, the ratio had improved to 5.9 to 1, nearly 6 Zeros destroyed for every Wildcat lost. This was not because the Wildcat had suddenly become faster or more maneuverable. This was because Wildcat pilots had learned to exploit their aircraft's strengths, particularly its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Japanese intelligence officers analyzed the combat reports from Guadalcanal. They noted the kill ratios. They recorded the claims by American pilots. They attempted to understand why Japanese air superiority, which had seemed absolute in December 1941, had eroded so quickly. Some of the analysis was accurate. Japanese reports correctly identified that American early warning systems and radar gave Wildcat pilots tactical advantages. Japanese analysts correctly noted that American pilots had developed effective defensive tactics. They recognized that the loss of experienced Japanese pilots at Coral Sea and Midway had degraded the overall skill level of the Zero squadrons. But Japanese intelligence still did not identify self-sealing fuel tanks as a critical factor. The concept existed in Japanese technical literature. Japanese engineers knew that Germany and Britain both used protected fuel systems. Some Japanese aircraft designers had proposed adding similar protection to the Zero or to new fighter designs. But the proposals were consistently rejected as too heavy, too expensive, or too complex to manufacture with Japan's industrial limitations. The institutional resistance to admitting that the Zero's design had a fundamental flaw remained stronger than the evidence suggesting that flaw existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The moment when the truth became undeniable did not arrive through intelligence reports or technical analysis. It arrived through direct experience. In July 1942, a Zero flown by Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga participated in a raid on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. During the attack, Koga's aircraft was hit by ground fire. The Zero's unprotected fuel system was damaged. Koga attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island, a small, uninhabited island about 25 miles from Dutch Harbor. The landing was nearly perfect. The Zero touched down on soft tundra, but the soft ground caught the landing gear, flipping the aircraft inverted. Koga died, either from the impact or from injury sustained during the combat. The Zero remained on Akutan Island for nearly 5 weeks before a U.S. Navy patrol spotted it. A salvage team recovered the aircraft and shipped it to Naval Air Station San Diego. There, American technical intelligence officers had their first opportunity to thoroughly examine an intact Zero. They measured its dimensions, they weighed its components, they tested its engine, they evaluated its control surfaces, and they examined its fuel system. The American analysts found exactly what they expected based on German aircraft examined earlier in the war. The Zero's fuel tanks were simple aluminum vessels with no protection whatsoever, no rubber layers, no sealant, no CO2 purge system to reduce vapor, just bare metal that would rupture when hit and allow fuel to spray freely. The Americans who examined the aircraft understood immediately why Zeros burned so readily in combat. The design made catastrophic fires nearly inevitable when the fuel system was hit. But the capture of the Akutan Zero did not change Japanese understanding because the Japanese did not know it had been captured. American intelligence classified the find at the highest level. The Zero was repaired, test-flown, and analyzed exhaustively. American pilots flew against it in mock combat to understand its strengths and weaknesses. The information derived from the Akutan Zero informed American fighter tactics and influenced American fighter design. But the Japanese learned none of this. As far as Japanese intelligence knew, Koga Zero had simply disappeared. One more aircraft lost in the vastness of the Pacific. The pattern continued. By late 1943, new American fighters appeared in the Pacific. The Grumman F4F Hellcat and the Vought F4U Corsair both featured self-sealing tanks as standard equipment. Both were faster than the Zero. Both were more heavily armed. Both were far more survivable. The kill ratios shifted even more dramatically in favor of American pilots. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 400 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered. Even at this late stage, even with overwhelming evidence of American aircraft survivability, Japanese responses focused on training, tactics, and numerical strength rather than on fundamental design problems. New Zero variants introduced in 1943 and 1944 made modest improvements in speed and armament. But self-sealing tanks and pilot armor were not added until the A6M6 variant, which appeared only in prototype form near the end of the war. By then, it was far too late. The experienced pilots who might have benefited from the protection were already dead. The industrial capacity to produce protected fighters in meaningful numbers no longer existed, and the air war had already been lost. The irony was complete. Japanese pilots had watched Wildcats absorb damage and survive throughout 1942. They had reported this phenomenon to their commanders. They had wondered why American aircraft seemed so difficult to destroy with the kind of hits that would doom a Zero. The information was there. The pattern was visible. But the institutional, psychological, and cultural barriers to accepting what the evidence showed proved insurmountable. Japanese naval aviation went to war believing that performance and pilot skill could overcome any material disadvantage. By the time that belief collided with the reality of self-sealing fuel tanks and American industrial capacity, the outcome of the air war had already been determined. The Wildcat remained in production throughout the war. Grumman built approximately 1,988 F4F variants between September 1937 and May 1943, when the company shifted its focus entirely to the newer F4F Hellcat. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division took over Wildcat production and built an additional 5,837 aircraft between August 1942 and August 1945. Total production reached 7,825 aircraft, nearly 3/4 of all. Wildcats ever built came from General Motors factories that had been producing automobiles just months before. This production achievement itself illustrated the difference in industrial philosophy. The United States could convert automobile factories to aircraft production. The workers who had assembled cars learned to assemble fighters. The supply chains that had delivered steel and rubber for civilian vehicles now delivered materials for military aircraft. The same management systems that had made mass production of automobiles efficient now made mass production of fighters possible. Japan possessed no equivalent industrial capacity. Japanese aircraft production remained largely artisanal, with skilled workers building aircraft in smaller facilities using more labor-intensive methods. The Wildcats' combat record justified the investment. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying. Wildcats flew 15,553 combat sorties during the war. 14,027 of these sorties were flown from aircraft carriers. They destroyed 1,327 enemy aircraft, according to official claims, at a cost of 178 aircraft lost in aerial combat, 24 lost to ground fire, and 49 lost to operational causes. The overall kill-to-loss ratio was 6.9 to 1. Nearly 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Wildcat lost. This ratio improved dramatically over the course of the war as American pilots gained experience and Japanese pilot quality deteriorated. The Wildcats served in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. In the Atlantic, Wildcats flying from escort carriers hunted German submarines and protected convoys. Fleet Air Arm Wildcats shot down German aircraft over Norway in some of the war's last air-to-air combat missions, but the Pacific was where the Wildcats' legacy was forged. From Wake Island in December 1941 to the Philippines in 1944, the Wildcat fought in every major campaign. 46 American pilots became aces flying Wildcats. Some, like Joe Foss and Marion Carl, became among the highest-scoring aces of the war. By mid-1943, newer American fighters began replacing the Wildcat on fleet carriers. The F4F Hellcat was faster, climbed better, and carried heavier armament. The F4U Corsair offered even better performance. But the Wildcat continued serving on escort carriers, whose shorter flight decks and lower operating speeds made the Wildcat's forgiving handling characteristics valuable. FM2 Wildcats, the improved General Motors variant, flew from escort carriers through the end of the war. They provided air cover during amphibious landings. They conducted anti-submarine patrols. They attacked ground targets with bombs and rockets. The little fighter that had been designed in the late 1930s remained effective in 1945. The Zero's story followed a different trajectory. Japan built 10,939, a 6M variance between 1939 and 1945. This was more than any other Japanese combat aircraft. But unlike American production, which accelerated throughout the war, Japanese Zero production peaked in 1943 and then declined. Shortages of raw materials, particularly aluminum and aviation fuel, constrained output. Bombing raids on Japanese factories disrupted production. The industrial base that had been stretched thin at the start of the war collapsed under the strain of total war. More devastating than production problems was the loss of pilots. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained pilots. These men were superbly skilled, the product of rigorous training programs that emphasized flying ability and combat technique. But Japan had no system for rotating experienced pilots back to training units to pass their knowledge to new pilots. Experienced aviators flew combat missions until they were killed, wounded, or incapacitated by illness. The attrition was unsustainable. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway in May and June 1942 cost Japan approximately 120 trained carrier pilots. Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943 cost hundreds more. Each loss was irreplaceable. The training system could not produce new pilots quickly enough, and the new pilots it did produce received progressively less training time. By 1943, Japanese pilot training had been reduced from the pre-war standard of approximately 700 hours to as little as 300 hours. By late 1944, some pilots graduated with only 40 hours of flight time. They were sent to frontline units knowing they would probably die in their first combat mission. American pilot training followed the opposite pattern. Early in the war, American pilots received good but not exceptional training. As the war progressed, the training system expanded and improved. Experienced combat pilots rotated back to training commands to teach. Training hours increased. New pilots arriving at combat squadrons in 1944 and 1945 were better prepared than their predecessors had been in 1942. This difference in pilot quality, combined with American numerical superiority and better aircraft, created kill ratios that became almost absurd. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American pilots shot down approximately 400 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, while losing approximately 123 of their own. The engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zero's final role was perhaps its most tragic. On October 25, 1944, volunteer pilots from various units flew Zeros loaded with bombs in deliberate suicide attacks against American ships during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The kamikaze, divine wind, concept represented a complete admission that conventional tactics had failed. If Japanese pilots could not survive combat long enough to become effective, then the solution was to not try to survive. The Zero's range and handling characteristics made it suitable for suicide missions. Approximately 2,800 kamikaze attacks were conducted during the last year of the war. Many used Zeros. These attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged 368 others. But they also consumed the last of Japan's aircraft and pilots in a futile attempt to change an outcome that was already determined. The contrast between the two aircraft, the two design philosophies, the two industrial systems, and the two approaches to pilot training tells the larger story of the Pacific War. The United States entered the conflict with inferior equipment but superior industrial capacity and a willingness to learn from experience. American forces lost battles in 1942 but analyzed those losses, adapted tactics, improved equipment, and returned stronger. The institutional culture encouraged feedback from combat units. Pilots who identified problems with their aircraft saw those problems addressed in new production models or in field modifications. The system was flexible, adaptive, and ultimately overwhelming. Japan entered the conflict with superior equipment but inflexible doctrine and limited industrial capacity. Japanese forces won stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942, but interpreted those victories as validation of existing assumptions rather than as temporary advantages that would diminish. The institutional culture discouraged criticism of accepted practices. Problems identified by combat units were often attributed to failures of will or spirit rather than to material causes. The system was rigid, unable to adapt quickly, enough to changing circumstances, and ultimately inadequate to the demands of total war against an industrial superpower. The self-sealing fuel tank, this unglamorous piece of technology, encapsulated these differences. It represented a willingness to trade performance for survivability, to accept that aircraft would be damaged in combat and should be designed to bring their pilots home. It represented industrial capacity sufficient to accept weight penalties without crippling effectiveness. It represented a design philosophy that valued pilot lives, not out of sentiment, but out of practical recognition that trained pilots were valuable assets that should be preserved when possible. Japanese intelligence observed Wildcats surviving damage throughout 1942 and 1943. They knew something was different, but they never identified the specific technology that made the difference, never analyzed the implications, and never implemented comparable protection until far too late. This failure was not the result of stupidity or incompetence. It was the result of institutional and cultural factors that made certain kinds of information difficult to accept and certain kinds of changes difficult to implement. The legacy extends beyond the Pacific War. Modern military aircraft, regardless of nation, include self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. The lesson was learned universally. Aircraft survivability matters, pilot survivability matters, and protection systems are worth their weight penalty. But in 1942, only one side had learned that lesson. Only one side had implemented that technology. And by the time the other side recognized what they were facing, the war had moved beyond their ability to respond effectively. The story of the Wildcat and the Zero, of self-sealing tanks and unprotected fuel systems, reminds us that wars are won not just by courage or tactics or even by individual weapon systems. Wars are won by industrial capacity, by institutional flexibility, by the ability to learn from experience and adapt faster than the enemy. The Japanese pilots who watched Wildcats absorb hits and survive saw the evidence of American advantages. But seeing evidence and understanding its implications are different things. Understanding implications and implementing responses are different things still. By the time Japanese naval aviation understood what they were facing, the ability to respond had been lost to attrition, industrial collapse, and the overwhelming momentum of American material superiority. Those Wildcats that flew from carriers and island bases throughout the Pacific carried more than guns and ammunition. They carried the accumulated advantages of American industrial capacity, American design philosophy, American pilot training systems, and American willingness to accept that survivability mattered as much as performance. They carried the proof that rubber and sealant and layers of protection, unglamorous and invisible from the outside, could be more important than speed or maneuverability. They carried home pilots who would fight again, learn from each mission, and become progressively more effective. And they demonstrated, mission after mission, combat after combat, that material advantages compound over time in ways that no amount of courage or skill can overcome. The Japanese never knew that F4F Wildcats had self-sealing fuel tanks, but they learned, through loss after loss, pilot after pilot, that American aircraft were somehow more survivable than their own. They observed the pattern, they reported the pattern, but they never connected the pattern to its cause, never understood the specific technology that created the advantage, and never implemented adequate responses. That failure, replicated across dozens of similar technological and doctrinal differences, determined the outcome of the air war in the Pacific. The outcome was never in doubt once American industry fully mobilized. The only question was how long it would take and how many would die before the inevitable conclusion. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.